Hello and welcome to Flipping the Table. It is Black History Month, and today's episode reveals the history of one Black farmer, Leonard Diggs, and his devotion to expanding the opportunities and chances of success for historically marginalized women and farmers of color seeking to become part of the nation's agriculture sector. Leonard and Michael explore the path to scaling up the number of farmers and ranchers needed to sustain our nation's abundance and heal some of its many wounds. Enjoy the show.
It's not in the news, but there is an agricultural crisis underway in America. At its peak, there were 6.8 million farms and ranches in the U.S., and that was in 1935, when there were just 127 million people in this entire country. Today, when we have just under 332 million people in the U.S., there are only 2.1 million farms and ranches remaining. Low farm gate prices, extreme weather, particularly drought, supply chain disruptions due to tariff wars and COVID, energy prices, and labor shortages are killing farms and ranches. Fewer farms and ranches mean fewer farmers and ranchers. In the view of many of us committed to a bright future for agriculture, there is a deep belief that the nation has too few operators of agricultural businesses to sustain the food supply into the future. And it is probably obvious to listeners that over 90% of the nation's farmers and ranchers identify as white. I was surprised, but happy to learn, that 36% of American farmers and ranchers are women, and 56% of all agricultural operations have at least one woman who is a decision maker on the team. When you consider race in agriculture, the situation is more concerning. According to USDA, a bit over 6% of our primary producers of food are Latino, about 2% are Black, and just over 1% are Asian, and less than 1%. In fact, only 79,000 farmers identify as Native American. Nevertheless, both advocates for food system change and government policy are looking to an influx of more women and more Black, Indigenous, and people of color to boost the farmer and rancher population. But that is a challenge given the economic and other factors blocking new and beginning farmers, particularly land access. This brings me to my guest today, Leonard Diggs, who leads the Regenerator Project at Cascade Ranch, which is committed to supporting farmers who have been historically underserved by policy and programs. This project is a collaborative program, which you could call a farmer incubator, involving Pie Ranch and the Amamutsin Tribal Band and Land Trust. Leonard is both an African-American farmer and a veteran organic farmer with decades of experience educating others about farming. He was on the original Roots of Change Council that formed the organization for which I work, but we had met a decade earlier in Sonoma County. As you will hear from his history, it has been an interesting journey from the Sacramento Valley to the Santa Rosa Plain to the coast, where he now mentors the next generation of farmers who will help in the rejuvenation of the field by enlarging the human talent needed to sustain the nation's agricultural abundance. As you will hear, Leonard and his mentees are using farming systems that solve our biggest challenges by capturing carbon, minimizing water, and supporting biodiversity. It is Black History Month, and Leonard's history is both inspiring and instructive. His story points a way to scale up the training and incubating of new farmers who have the skills, knowledge, and fortitude necessary to succeed. We explore the critical question of how these new farmers will obtain land from which to produce our food, and how local communities can support the proliferation of new agricultural operations. So let us begin our conversation, which I know you will enjoy. Leonard, it is fantastic to be with you here on the coast near Pescadero at Cascade Ranch. Looking forward to the conversation.
Oh, it's great to have you. It's great to be here in this breezy zone that we're sitting in.
Yeah, breezy. It's a cool, why don't you describe for folks what we're sitting in?
Yeah, we're sitting in a parlor that was built by the farmer who spent the most time on this property here. Well, I won't say the farmer who spent the most time, because there was ranchers who were here in the early 1800s, but he, in the modern times, through the 1900s, had been here for 50 years with his family farming. And he built this to entertain his friends. And by all reports, he was really a generous and gregarious guy. And he would just invite people over and feed them and have an opportunity to share his wine that he would make here on the property with them. So
wow, it's cool. It's kind of like a bar. It's we're sitting in chairs that are like you see in a soda fountain, an old-fashioned soda fountain at a, what do you call this, a rectangular bar.
It is.
Looking out towards the coast and the ocean.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place.
And it's why I call it the parlor, like an ice cream parlor. And because I'm very sensitive, and I got sensitive to this when I was talking to Chairman Lopez, who's the leader of the Amamutsan tribe, that many of the people in the tribe, are struggling with addictions of various types, and that they are very careful when they bring their stewards to locations that would trigger them in ways that, challenge them with some of the demons that they're trying to work on. And so it hit me right away that, there was drinking libation in here, but also you could eat in here. You could have all other things happening in this space. So for me, it's a parlor.
A parlor, perfect. Well, it's a good place for us to be doing this conversation. So, before we get into the work you're doing here at the Regenerator program on the ranch, I'm really interested in hearing your origin stories. Like, how did your interest in agriculture begin? What was the pathway that brought you Regenerator program at Cascade Ranch?
Yeah, it's California based. I'm born and raised in California, and my family on both sides have been in California for a long time. On my father's side, they came to California in the 1800s, and we were all in a small town called Woodland, which is the center of Yolo County. It's the county seat, and my mother's side was in Sacramento, and her mother and father and her grandmother all migrated to Sacramento area from the Oklahoma area. Her grandmother
During the Dust Bowl?
No,
or before?
It was after the Dust Bowl, and in part I don't know the history, which is kind of common sometimes with African Americans. It's difficult to know the history. My mom didn't even have her birth certificate for many, many years. We used to celebrate her birthday in April, and it wasn't until we were adults that she got her birth certificate, and we found out that she was born in March.
Wow.
And she was raised by her grandmother. There was 8 of them, and in the Sacramento area. So, long history, but even though my grandmother and my mother had a piece of property that they could grow their food on, there was really no agriculturalist in the traditional sense. And I think that that's something that has to be pushed back and challenged all the time. But there was no traditional farmers in my family. And so for me, I fell into it because I had a love of the outdoors. I realized that when as a kid, I was on my bike outside all the time. I lived outside. We played outside. We biked outside out to the rivers because we were close to the edge of town. And I then was able to get into the YMCA and start camping, and became a mountain camp counselor, and then liked to backpack all the time. So I realized that I wanted to be outside. And I didn't realize that agriculture was my path, although I had a lot of summer jobs where I worked. I would bike from my house when I lived in Davis all the way to Woodland to work on a farm as a box boy.
That's a long ride.
It's a long ride. I used to ride my bike back and forth from Davis to Woodland a lot.
Wow.
And I did it every day when I worked for that farmer because I had to get there early in the morning. And
you must have a strong heart. It's built up your heart muscles.
I still think it's there. I still, those years of biking, all those years when I was young and into my early 20s and 30s even, I was able to, have good breath. And I was on his farm. He had tomatoes. Timothy Ranch was the name of the ranch. And I would be the one who would put the full bins of tomatoes on the truck that hauled it to the cannery. And I was also the one who would load the empty bins onto the tractor that would take it out to the field. I learned how to drive semi trucks to haul those tomatoes later on, and the same truck driver who hauled most of Timothy's tomatoes let me use his truck to get my Class 1 license. At that time it was Class 1, now it's Class A. And so I had all these peripheral jobs around agriculture. I worked for a fertilizer company in the summer. And then when I first went to college, I went to UC Irvine, and I forced myself to be a biological science major. Even though I was more interested in humanities, I forced myself because I wanted to do something real, and I felt like that was something I needed to challenge myself with. And there was a good biosci program at UC Irvine. There's also a great humanities program there. And I almost got swept into it because I loved it, but I stuck with it, and I transferred back to Davis. And I went there thinking, my pathway is to go into forestry because I like being outside. But then I transferred into ag science management when I was at Davis because it was the only major that I could transfer into from UC Irvine. And I started looking at it, and I ended up in a house that I lived with a bunch of other Aggies. It was called the Agrarian Effort. And it was a cooperative house where people who were interested in agriculture lived, and we had our own garden. And I realized, wow, I have a green thumb. I really like this. This resonates with my spirit. And I was at the right place at UC Davis, and I got on the path and started farming.
Wow. So we met through Sarah Lee McClellan Cundy, who started one of the first organic farms in Sonoma County. Way back, what year was that?
Yeah, so I started there in 1991.
91. So I met you about 92, I think, because that's when I might have been before. Yeah, about 92, 93. How did Sarah Lee find you, or how did you find her?
Yeah, it's good. So Sacramento had a demonstration farm called The Farm. And I first worked there as an employee 1 year, and then I was given the duties of being the farm manager. And it was about 3.5 acres, and we grew everything there. I grew rice, I grew kiwis, grapes. We had aquaculture demonstrations, so we had fish. We had a greenhouse, state-of-the-art greenhouse, so we had hydroponics inside of the greenhouse. And we were there to demonstrate the breadth of California agriculture. And I would go to farms all over the state, and I would mimic what they did. And sometimes I would bring back, like cotton 1 year, I actually went to a cotton field the first year and dug some up and brought it back at a right stage. After that, I planted it by seed and would grow the cotton. And I created a rice pond and would grow rice. So I had an opportunity to really sample the breadth of the crops that we have in California. And also, we had Golden Delicious apples there, and I got to realize that Golden Delicious, when they're grown on the tree to ripeness, really are delicious.
They are.
They're not like what you get in the store. And my college roommate, who was at the Agrarian Effort, which was where we met, was Paul Vossen.
Oh, wow.
And so Paul Vossen, as you know, became the farm advisor in Sonoma County.
Yep.
And when Sarah Lee...
And did tons on apples, organic apples.
Tons on organic apples and a lot of other things. We taught together through the SRJC, which is another bridge.
College.
That's right. Another bridge that I can share with you. But we taught a specialty crop class shortly after I came there, where we were focused on what does it really take for farmers, because there was a lot of people that were coming to him as a extension agent saying, hey, I want to farm, I want to do this, I want to do that. And he'd take notes of all those people who came to him. And because he just couldn't give them all the same information every time, he created this specialty crops class. And I would teach one part, he would teach one part. We did this dog and pony show where we'd go through the breadth of all that it would take to start a farm, market your product, all of the conditions that you need to consider. So Paul knew Sarah Lee well, and when she was looking to start the farmery, she said, hey, do you know somebody? He goes, well, I have a buddy who runs this place. And she went over to the farm and saw it in Sacramento, and she recruited me and asked me would I be willing to start this farm around the building that they had there to demonstrate the crops from Sonoma County. And I said, well, Sarah Lee, I've done something like that, and that's not enough for me. If I come over to Sonoma County, I'm going to want to farm. So you've got other ground there. If I can grow vegetable crops and create a real vegetable crop operation, which is an organic operation that would feed the building that you have with product, yeah, I'll come over. So
wow, that's very cool. I didn't really realize the Paul Vossen connection. And just for the audience, Sarah Lee McClellan Cundy came from a kind of really well-known dairy family near the Petaluma area in Sonoma County, and then married into a grape growing family, and they have grape operations, both the nursery and they grew grapes. She since passed, sadly, but she was a real. She gave a lot of people opportunity. She really got me started too through Select Sonoma County. So in a lot of ways. So yeah, that was a fertile time there, so to speak. So that's interesting. That's how you got there. So you've been teaching in a way your whole life.
In a lot of ways, yeah. I mean, it started with that demonstration farm and being a place to share with people. I mean, we had this spot, which I called it a garden for a family of 4. Because it was a way to give people that epiphany of what it would take to grow food and have that, self-sufficiency in your own house and what that looked like. So there's been an opportunity to share with people for a long time in my life, yes.
So then you worked for the farmery for, you can just say how many years, and then you jumped to the SRJC, Santa Rosa Junior College, and you taught there for many years.
Well, so 5 years is where we were at the farmery. And, Richard, who was Sarah Lee's husband, had land because he had the largest grapevine nursery, not only in the state, but in the nation. And he had ground in Fresno, and then there was ground there at the farmery. We had 20 acres there where it was growing product that we thought was going to be in the building, but that was 2008. And during 2008... 1998, excuse me. Yeah, ooh, jeepers. Jeepers. Here we go. My brain. Too many.
I know, I understand.
That was, 1998 was this first downturn, and this economic downturn, 1992, really, it was 1992, 90, in that zone, 92, 93, that there was this downturn. Now that I'm really looking
that was after the dot-com crash. I remember it.
Yes. So they decided that it didn't make sense to open up the farmery, that they had the building. They wanted to have a farm store. And Sarah Lee's vision was to sell all the different products that you could see in Sonoma County and to have it be a gateway location for that. So, 1992. But they'd already recruited me. And here I was. And I was like, well, you got this 20 acres. Let's just go for it. Let's sell organic product. And realizing that 20 acres floods even a community like Sonoma County. So I ended up selling product in San Francisco to some pretty good restaurants, pretty good stores, East Bay, Napa. So we were selling all over and had some ground in Fresno, got another couple of plots in Sonoma County, so that we were up to some pretty decent acreage. But even with that and with the money, that was one of my first lessons. Because I started that farm from scratch. And Richard was an auction guy and a coupon guy. He would always clip coupons. He was always looking at sales. And he made me go look for equipment. I would be going all over the state looking for used equipment to populate that farm with. And I bought a couple of new things. But even with the funds that the Cundys had, and with the market impact that we made, because one of the things that I learned early on is that quality really matters, and we got a reputation for putting out a really excellent.
I remember the produce. I used to buy it. Yeah,
quality product, but it takes a lot of finesse to make a living on that acreage, because 20 acres it jumps you up into what you're in a small pool. And it jumps you up into a little bit bigger of a pool where you're competing with people who have hundreds of acres and sometimes thousands of acres, and the margins are really low. And it's challenging. I mean, that was in the day when salad mix, you could get $20 a pound for salad mix. That's unheard of now.
I remember going to your salad mix operation. I remember seeing it.
We did. We had a good one. And that was the day when Sonoma County was full of a lot of mix masters, as I call them, so that they all had pride in the salad mix that they grew, and they could get a decent amount of money for it. But even then, it was very difficult. And after the 5 years, I said to Richard and Sarah Lee, I said, if you look at where we are, I said, you can make more money on grapes here than you can on vegetables. The return on your investment is going to be much better with grapes. And so after 5 years, I went on some of the other ground that we had been leasing around this county, and I started farming on my own. And I was doing that when the position that had been held for about 23, 24 years by the farm manager at Santa Rosa Junior College became available. He decided he wanted to go out and farm, grow hay. Schoen Farm, yes. And that I had been teaching with Paul. I had taught a couple of classes then, even at the college farm, so I became aware of it. And when the job became available, I said, well, throw my hat into the ring. And I was hired under the auspices of taking the farm in a more sustainable direction. And that was also a good lesson for me to learn, because people have different ideas of what sustainability means. I've been farming organically for all of my professional career. And so coming to Schoen Farm, where there had been just a small amount of organic and there was a lot of conventional farming, it was a transition for me. And what would it mean to make the conventional farming there sustainable farming was what I learned in the 21 years that I was there.
Yeah, 21 years. That went so fast, though, when I think back on it. I mean, okay, so then you did that, and then you decided you wanted to move on. And how did you get here?
I got here because Jared and Nancy invited me.
Who are the founders of Pie Ranch,
yeah,
which is just down the road.
Yeah, just like I said, less than a mile from here. The home piece, as we call it, home pie. And there was a youth program, and they wanted someone to share some of the basic principles of soil, but in a way that was approachable. And they wanted a face that a lot of the young people from the city could relate to, a brown face like mine, and, we haven't talked about that, but, that is the other aspect of, California agriculture is very provincial and it's very white, like most of the farming.
99%, 98%?
98%. At least.
Well, at least for the owners, the farmers. That's
a whole nother component of this conversation, and
right.
How I got here. So, being a brown man in that predominantly white dominated world, and in California in general, I've learned a lot. And Nancy and Jared have worked in terms of social justice and what they can do to bring young people who are living in more urban areas who don't get exposed to agriculture, to give them a sense of where their food comes from and access to that experience. So they wanted someone who they thought could be someone that looked similar to the people who were coming to their farm to come and teach that.
Trusted messenger.
Yeah, that soil message. And I thought about it a lot, and I, created a good lesson on soils that was approachable for young people to hear. While I was here that day, Jared said, "Hey, come on over. I want to show you some of this property that we're farming on," because I hadn't been here in a long time and saw what they were doing in a long time. So first he took me across the street, showed me this 80-acre piece that they were farming at that time, not farming it now, and showed me all the, the rotational things that were being done, the grain that was being grown, the vegetables, the livestock. And I said, "Oh, this is great. This is cool." He says, "But we have this other property, this 418-acre property, just over, just a little bit further down the road." And I said, "Jared, man, who's going to do that?" And he said, "You were going to do it." I was like,
so it was a setup. They got you over here.
It totally on his part it was.
Yeah.
But I said to him, "Man, I have a gig. I have a gig. I'm not doing this, So.
Well, this was when you were farming in Lake County.
Well, that's a whole nother story,
Okay.
because my wife Judith and I also had a property in Lake County, because she's a farmer from Switzerland and came here, and we met here and realized after she was here for just a couple of years, it's hard to be a farmer when you're working for other people. it's easier if you have your own ground. And so we couldn't afford it in Sonoma County. And so we went over to Lake County. And so it was so she had an opportunity to farm over there. At the same time, I was still working at Chone Farm. So I started commuting through 3 counties, Lake, Mendocino, and Sonoma County.
That's a long drive. I know that.
Yeah, it's a lot of books on tape.
Yeah. Well, that's
or
actually,
CDs.
that's not a bad thing to have. But anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. So I realized after thinking about what they had asked and talking with Judith long and hard about it, that I just felt this urgency. I had been, doing a lot to support what I thought was going to be a training program for entry-level farmers, for emerging farmers, as we could look at the students that were at SRJC and at many of the college farms that I know around the state. But I realized after having farmed that it's important to have the early stage farmers that have 5 to 10 years in it be supported, and be supported in some really crucial ways right now. It's not just about what we are providing here at the Cascade Ranch for the Cascade Regenerator Program, which is land and equipment and relationships to community members and marketing, if we can, in ways that are relevant to them. And I realized that group of farmers had another hurdle, which is that we were in this climate crisis, and it was necessary for next-gen farmers not just to be organic, not just to be sustainable or regenerative, as we've migrated to that word, but to farm in a way that's relevant to their community in terms of ecosystem services and sinking carbon, conserving water, doing all the things that are going to maintain the biological diversity on a property. And I know from all the years that I farmed and trained farmers and worked with lots of farmers that many of them don't look at those things very hard. There's some aspects of sustainability that are embedded into being organic, and all of the organic certifiers require you to have that component of what you're doing to maintain the biological diversity on your property. But to really be committed to it is expensive. Yeah. And putting up one hedgerow, creating a little bit of a corridor, maybe setting back a little bit from any waterways that are running through your property, a certain amount, is not enough. And if we are going to have farms that are really going to make a difference in the future, they had to encompass all of it at the same time. Be organic, look at some of the regenerative rotation practices, figure out how to save water. So all the farmers here in this program have water budgets that are required of them as part of their crop plan. What's your water budget? And let's work on that. How can we be more efficient? And then to be embedded into the carbon farm plan that we have here on the property. So I realized that was where I wanted to go on this last hurrah for myself in terms of being involved in agriculture and supporting it in whatever way I could, and other ideas that I'm developing now, how the technical support can be developed into it also. Mm-hmm. And so I really saw that this was a place to do that and to start making a program from whole cloth that I thought would make a difference.
We hope you are enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
It's beautiful because it's, you spent the bulk of your career honing your skills, both farming skills, but also your human skills. I mean, I think back to what you said about when you were at Irvine. I mean, you were into the humanities. I mean, you've always been, the thing that struck me about you is you've always been a very open, empathetic, thoughtful person. I mean, you engage at depth. You're not a surface person. And so you've combined those skills, the teaching, the relationship building, with the technical skills you developed at farming, and now you get to bring all that together and create something of your own, not the university, not the colleges, not the McClellan Cundies, your thing. That's a beautiful thing. So you got us here. Now I want you to just very quickly describe what happens here, what the mission is, and then I want to move on beyond that.
Yeah, so the important thing is, most of these is, who do we serve? And what we're here to serve are, as I said, the next-gen farmers, but many of the next-gen farmers that we need to support have limited resources and traditionally haven't had access to ownership and leadership. And it starts with women. Mm-hmm. So we're here to serve women. We're here to serve Black and Indigenous people of color, folks who have been on the margins most of the time. Many of them, as I think you started to allude to, are on these farms already, know how to farm. They come from farming traditions. Many of them have migrated from farming traditions. Why were African Americans brought to this country? Because they came from farming traditions and they had lots of those skills, and they were able to parlay those skills for somebody else's profit. So it was time for us to begin to support that group of people and to begin to create circumstances for them to be able to migrate into the next stage of leadership in California agriculture.
Mm-hmm. So they come here, they have some skills. So what is it specifically that you give them here that gets them from that? I thought that was interesting. You said 5 to 10 years. Because I do remember when we were first coming up in Sonoma County, a lot of people that we knew went into farming. I think of Left Field Farm and others who actually went out after a while because it was so hard to do it. They started to have kids and families, and it was really difficult, Sonoma County particularly, because land was so expensive. I dabbled, and I realized early on, there's no way I'm going to be able to afford land here, so I went into another direction. But you saw that 5 to 10 year period is so important to actually get someone grounded. So what are you giving to them in this period of their development?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So when I was teaching that class with Paul Voss in the specialty crops class, we saw a lot of people come in. I only know of one maybe that's still at it. Mm-hmm. I mean, the attrition rate is tough.
It's phenomenal.
And some were made really good inroads into it, but some of them came into it old, and they then by the time, they were up to steam 5 years in, their bodies were tired, and it's a tough game.
They were living in poverty, a lot of them.
Yeah, and a lot of them came to it with money from retirement, from doing something else.
Right.
So they could afford to leverage into it, and they put their house where their farm was, and so it made it possible for them to, as many farmers have to, live where they work, and so that made it possible. But at some point, they ran out of steam. Mm-hmm. You mentioned Quetzal's farm, and what is interesting there is Will, who now has Longer Table Farm. He is part of a conversation that's going on in Sonoma County with how do we get limited resource farmers on land in Sonoma County. And he made a really important comment, which is that, hey, I've been at this for about 10 years now, and I'm at that point where I'm like, whoa, can I keep this going? Mm-hmm. I'm tired. It's expensive. I'd like to own something someday. And I hear that you, the Land Trust, are thinking about supporting, these emerging farmers, but there's a whole group of us who've now got this 5 to 10 year wad of knowledge and capability and market presence. And if you don't support us, that's a big wad of capital that goes away.
Yeah, wasted
intellectual capital that goes away. And I've seen that, and I think that was the other part of my experience over the years that I've been here, is that a lot of intellectual capital just falls away with young farmers and with individual small farm, medium-sized farms. Corporate farms, they have a way of preserving their intellectual capital, but small farms, medium-sized farms don't. Mm-hmm. And so there has to be a bigger network to keep that alive. And so it was really obvious to me that in order to make this a viable approach, we needed to support that group that was already at that stage. They know what they want to grow. They have somewhat of a market presence already, but they just need another leg up. They need tenure in land that really is going to be viable for them. It's going to be affordable for them. They need some equipment that maybe they're short of.
So you give them access to land here. You give them equipment they can share.
Yes, and we start out at a very low rate. So it's a 5-year program. First year, the property prices for being involved in the program are $150 per acre.
Wow.
It goes $150, $250, $350, $450, $550. And as part of that, too, this is another element, is that I realize capitalizing is really important for this generation of farmers.
For them to develop capital, a pool of capital.
A pool of capital. They need a pool of capital once they're done with the program, and they need it in various ways. So I immediately established a savings account. So the 20% of whatever they pay in for the land that they're leasing, for the housing that we've provided to those farmers who are here and housed on the property, we are putting 20% of that aside with FarmLink in these capital accounts.
Great.
So
California FarmLink is a partner.
They are.
They're a lender
Yes.
of low-interest loans for agriculture.
Correct.
Over long, favorable terms to get young farmers or farmers going.
Exactly.
Good.
So they and other stakeholders that we are partnering with are all concerned about how we provide service to this group of farmers and what's at stake. Because the stakes are really high right now. We are about ready to churn over all of the baby boomer farmers, and many of them are even older. And some of them have already, the patriarch in the family has died, and the wife is holding on to it, and maybe with brothers and cousins and neighbors still farming. But there's a lot of that land that's about ready to churn. And it's going to churn in one or two ways. It's going to be community-based farms, which are the family farms that I'm talking about, or it's going to be corporate farms or venture capitalists who are buying property and doing something with it.
Yeah, so just share, before we got on to record, you told me that statistic about Washington. That was fascinating.
Yeah, so in kind of the looking around at what it takes to keep farms alive, I stumbled onto the knowledge that Washington State is really committed as a whole state to keep agriculture alive in their state. And they've done the evaluation of the farms that are currently in Washington State, and they came to the realization that 70% of the farmers are not planning on transitioning their farms.
They have no plans.
No plans to transition.
70%
of the farmers in Washington State. I was shocked. I was like, whoa, how does that look in California? Now, California is a whole different animal because of the amount of large farms and venture capitalists that are invested in agriculture. But still, if you're looking at family farms from 50 to 500 acres, it would be a very interesting question for them. What are your plans? What are your succession plans here? So realizing that we needed to model something that would provide not only the farmers regionally a place to be, but hopefully start the conversation that needed to happen. Like, what are we going to do to support next-gen farmers in a way that's really viable?
Okay, good. So that's helpful. Now I want you to, if you would, describe the relationship to the Amamutsan. I think that's quite interesting because there are other farm programs that I know of, but this is the first one I came across where there was really a developed partner relationship with a tribe.
Yeah, and it started with Jared and Nancy really reaching out to Chairman Lopez, chairman of the Amamutsan tribe, and inviting them into the property at Pie Ranch and saying, hey, we'd like to support you in ways that are relevant to you. And so there's a native garden over at Pie Ranch, and there's been a developing relationship with the tribe and with their Amamutsan land trust that they've created. And the trust was created in an attempt to save some of the plants that were relevant to the tribe before first contact and begin to repropagate those and to primarily expose the people in their tribe to the foods that are associated with that. So that relationship was developed at Pie Ranch, and then they had the opportunity to get a grant to grow some seeds and other for native plants to be able to plant at Quirosté State Park, which is, as a crow flies, only a mile from here.
And just talk about the Quirosté, because we didn't mention that.
Yeah, the Quirostés are the unceded tribe that was in this whole region before first contact, but there are no living members of that tribe anymore. And Amamutsan tribe is really originally from the Santa Cruz area. And when the missions came in, the mission Santa Rosa was one of the most brutal Santa Cruz, excuse me. Missions everywhere. And Santa's all over the place. I've lived in Santa Rosa. Now I live near Santa Cruz.
Right. It's true.
Sorry. But so Mission Santa Cruz was one of the more brutal missions that there were, and a lot of the Amamutsan tribe members died there from their indentured servitude, basically. So they had as a mission to try to keep alive the knowledge that they had, and they decided that they wanted to start to propagate plants, and we were able to provide them a part of the land here we have at Cascade for them to have propagation land and to have a hoop house where they could propagate the plants originally. Last year they grew 70,000 plants that then in either seed form or transplant form went over to Croste State Park so that they could repopulate that park in a project with state parks.
Nice, good. So are there Amamutsan young people that come here to learn to farm or develop their farming skills, or is that separate?
Yeah, it's a good question. The language is different because many indigenous folks didn't farm in the traditional way that we call farming, and they shouldn't have to find their legitimacy by farming in the same way that we farm. The term that's mostly used is stewardship. Mm-hmm. And stewarding the plants that are there. And Truman Lopez, when he first walked with me on the property, he says, we don't grow our crops in straight lines and squares like you do. They're patches. And we look for the right patch for certain things to be. And so, for example, on the west side of Cascade, I've found these patches of yarrow. And I have now used our modern technology of GPS techniques of being able to map exactly where those patches are so that I can preserve them and farm around them and realize that we've got to create these layers in these projects where the interface between the working landscapes and the conservation landscapes and the
knitting biodiversity.
Yes, weaving it together.
Yeah, weaving
it together in these ways that are more complex, more difficult. They're not simple as just being able to farm from edge to edge on your field, and anything that's in between is cleared out. So that's part of what we've been doing here, and that relationship that we have here stemmed from what they started at Pie Ranch.
Well, that's fascinating, and it actually gives me kind of joy and hope for the future that there's an example of a farmer who's spent so many years doing what you've been doing, who is embracing this linkage to the indigenous knowledge and the indigenous methodologies, and bringing a whole new generation of farmers into that vision of how it can work together. Because when you drive the Central Valley of California, I often think, God, if all these big farms learned how to weave in different places on those properties, more diversity, that would be so good in so many ways. For other animals, the other species that are impacted, but also for the capture of carbon, for the water cycles, for the beauty. It would just be a great thing. So it's nice to see it kind of being incubated here. And this brings me to the last thing I want to talk to you about in the time that we have remaining, which is, given your pedagogical experience and your creation of something from whole cloth, as you said here, that is a model of how to bring in another generation or to support the emergence of the next generation of farmers. How do we scale it? Because there are 2 million farmers left in this country, 2 million, I think, in a country of 311 or 330 million people. All this talk about the age that you brought up, all these people going out soon, because they've hit 50, 60, 70, and they got to retire. How are we going to have enough farmers? What's it going to take to train all those people? How do we scale it?
I think it starts with a new worldview. And the one that I've been tumbling around in my brain starts with the term food sovereignty. And I think it starts at home sovereignty. Sovereignty is the phrase that I've been using that came from my thoughts in this, is that it starts with what you can do at home. What can you grow at home? What can you grow in your neighborhood? And then to be able to expand that. Right now, urban farming is on the rise in this country, and it's an important component of the solution and of the direction that we need to go. But it starts with people realizing that they've got to do something around, even if it's a pot, even if it's just a little garden. But with their neighbors, they start bartering. With their neighbors, they start learning. And getting 50, I'm being really optimistic, but if you could get 50% of your food in your neighborhood and then go to the urban farmers that are in the circle, the first concentric circle next to you, then go to the small farmers and medium-sized farmers that are in the next concentric circle outside of the urban boundaries. And we start there with being able to expand the idea of who's involved in producing food, who has access to it. And food deserts is a comment that's made all the time, but we've got to blow past that and talk about food sovereignty, food for everybody where they live. So then you begin to expose people who are in their teens, people in junior high, because if they don't have an image of themselves as food stewards and land stewards by that time, they may grow into their high school years and realize, that's not who I am. They have to have some kind of experience with it at a younger age and begin to relate to it in their neighborhoods, in their communities. And then from that, we can glean 3 to 4% of the population to go back out and farm. But it's a whole system. It's a network. Mm-hmm. It's not something where we just go out to the UCs, and the state colleges and we say, grow us the next generation of farmers. And it's also not enough for us to have apprenticeships and interns on the current farms and say, grow us the next generation of farmers. It's got to be a network where we create a food system that's much more expansive.
Okay, that's interesting, and I can see what you mean. It's really like you said, it's about a different kind of consciousness or paradigm or worldview, where we're cultivating the awareness and the appreciation, like you described when you were young. You loved the outdoors, and that led you to jobs that eventually led you to realize that you had a green thumb, and that was going to be your life. It is interesting. I mean, in my life, when I was young, my cousins had a cattle ranch, and I went there in my first 10 years of my life through high school, and that totally affected my consciousness because it was a beautiful place where I saw people interacting with animals and producing food, and I realized, wow, this is beautiful, and it led me to this. So it is interesting about how important that phase is. And so we have lost touch because we've become urbanized and so many people are cut off. People talk about it all the time, cut off from our food system. But I do see the pendulum swinging back because young people know more, way more now, about quality food, and they hear conversations about food than when we were coming up. I mean, I never talked about food at school except for I had a class where we learned to bake pies and make spaghetti.
Yeah, no.
But that's changing now. I mean, it's in the media again, and so that gives me hope. But I think you're right. It does begin at the community level. That's why the investment in regional food system development is so critical now.
And policies are really important. I mean, one of the things that we're working on as an organization is creating some policies that's regional policies that are not just national policies, so that we can have a People's Food and Farm Bill for our region, mm-hmm. and begins to expand on these issues of sovereignty in the region. And
food security is another way to describe it, or resilience, community resilience.
It's all part of that, resilience and food security.
Because the climate is going to force it.
Yes. And regulation. The regulation is upon us statewide in terms of what farmers are going to be required to do in the future in terms of conserving water and also reducing the amount of carbon that goes out. I mean, we have purchased 2 electric tractors, and that's the first wave. We're going to be early adopters of that technology, but that's going to accelerate. Along with electric cars, there's going to be electric tractors. There's going to be a whole wave of approaches, but it's not just a technological fix. We're not going to just science ourselves out of this, as was said in Mars. We are going to have to build a community to work our way out of this. That whole adage of you go faster alone, but you go further together. We really are going to have to go through this as a community. That's why building the next generation of farmers and ranchers is a community affair.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a really great way to end this conversation. Leonard Diggs, thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Actually enjoyed knowing you for all these years and seeing your evolution. You're at the stage of mastery now, and you're really sharing what you've learned, and I'm really happy for you and grateful that you're in the world doing what you're doing. Thanks.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to our sponsors, the Ladybug Foundation, Dan and Quincy Imhoff, Beth and Mark Wyatt, Cindy Daniel, and Doug Lipton. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.